The United States had just dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing 39,000 people in an instant. Alistair Urquhart, who had already survived the death railway's brutal labor and a hell ship torpedoed beneath him, was knocked flat by the shockwave while emptying latrines at Fukuoka Camp 25. He had no idea what caused the blast, but he had just endured a third nightmare. This is his story, and it begins on the morning of September 3, 1939, in Aberdeen, Scotland. On the morning of September 3, 1939, Alistair Urquhart was working alone in a warehouse in Aberdeen, Scotland, when his managing director burst in with the news war had been declared. Urquhart, a 19-year-old apprentice, pedaled home to find his family gathered around the wireless, listening to Neville Chamberlain's grim broadcast. Within weeks, his call-up papers arrived, and he reported to the Gordon Highlanders barracks at Bridge of Dawn. He was one of the first to be conscripted, not the last, as his father had optimistically predicted. There was no gung-ho spirit among the nervous young men, only quiet resignation and the fear of losing their jobs. By late November, Urquhart and his draft were shipped across the English Channel to Cherbourg, then by train to Marseille, where they boarded the troopship SS Andes bound for Singapore. The voyage took 3 weeks, with stops at Port Said and Calcutta, and the soldiers drilled daily on deck under the tropical sun. When the liner finally docked in Singapore on December 22, 1939, Urquhart saw a gleaming skyline of white buildings and the famous Cathay Building. The British called this island the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress believed to be impregnable, but behind the confident headlines, the garrison was dangerously short of aircraft and tanks, and the officers seemed more concerned with spit and polish than jungle warfare. Urquhart trained at Selarong Barracks, where he quickly proved himself the fittest man in his company, winning the Battalion Athletics Cup for the 440-yard race and the high jump. He was transferred to Fort Canning, the underground headquarters of British forces in Malaya, and promoted to acting unpaid lance corporal, then to paid corporal. In his free time, he discovered Singapore's dance halls and met Tommy Barker, a signals corporal from Blackpool who shared his passion for ballroom dancing. Together, they won an amateur championship at the Happy World Dance Hall, partnering a Chinese taxi dancer named Nita, and Urquhart began giving lessons at a local studio. Tommy Barker kept Urquhart informed of the growing Japanese threat, and in December 1941, the news turned urgent. On the night of December 8th, Japanese bombs rained down on Fort Canning. Urquhart dived under his desk. 2 days later, the battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were sunk off the coast. The Japanese army landed on the Malay Peninsula and pushed south with shocking speed, supported by 300 tanks that British commanders had deemed unsuited for the terrain. Urquhart was put in charge of 3 boy soldiers, Freddie Brynd, his brother James Brynd, and John Scott, who had refused the option to escape with civilians. In February 1942, the Japanese landed on Singapore Island and fought their way toward the city. On February 14th, Urquhart heard news of a massacre at Alexandra Military Hospital where Japanese soldiers bayoneted patients on operating tables. The next day, General Arthur Percival surrendered the garrison of 80,000 men, and Japanese soldiers burst into Fort Canning, jabbing bayonets at Urquhart's chest. He was marched out with the others, his hands up. He was forced to walk 18 miles to the Changi Peninsula. They passed the severed heads of Chinese civilians impaled on poles, the work of the Suk Ching massacre. At Changi, the prison camp was overwhelmed with thousands of men, and Urquhart found a cramped outhouse for himself and the 3 boys. Food was scarce, just a cup of rice a day, infested with weevils and maggots. But Freddie Brynd proved a gifted scavenger, returning one day with a clutch of eggs that he cooked in a hidden pan. Urquhart tried to protect the boys, teaching them English, math, and Latin in a makeshift classroom so they could earn their general certificate of education. He kept a small photograph of Hazel Watson, a girl he had danced with before the war, tucked in his pocket, and at night he sometimes stared at it, wondering if he would ever see her again. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. In September 1942, the Japanese commander, Major General Shinpei Fukuye, demanded that all prisoners sign a pledge not to escape. When the Allied officers refused, 17,500 men were crammed into Selarang barracks designed for only 1,000, with no water and only open latrines. The standoff lasted 4 days with machine guns mounted on trucks and the prisoners singing Land of Hope and Glory to keep their spirits up. Finally, the Japanese threatened to bring in 2,500 sick and wounded men from the hospital, and the officers signed under duress. Urquhart signed as A.K. Urquhart in an illegible scrawl, knowing he could later deny it. By October 1942, the Japanese had begun selecting prisoners for forced labor on a railway through the jungles of Thailand and Burma. Urquhart was called to Lieutenant Emsley's office and told he was down for an upcountry draft. He said goodbye to the three boys, feeling as though he had failed them. Then he reported to the parade ground, where the Japanese promised a holiday camp with good food and rest. He did not believe them, but he had no choice. Within days, he would be packed into a steel railway wagon with 30 other men, starting a 5-day journey into the unknown. The journey became a slow torture. Men collapsed from dysentery and malaria, fouling the floor where they fell. Urquhart's turn at the door gap came every half hour, a brief relief before he was shouldered back into darkness. The train stopped often in jungle sidings, each halt raising hope that the doors would open. They never did. When the wagon finally rolled open at Ban Pong, the prisoners tumbled out like corpses coming back to life. One teenager lay dead in the corner, his body already stiff. There was no holiday camp. The Japanese handed each man a cup of rice and pointed north into the jungle. The column of 600 prisoners began a 160-kilometer forced march to Canyu 1. Urquhart's boots disintegrated within days. His feet bled on volcanic rock. Men who fell were left behind, their cries fading into the thick canopy. On the 6th night, they reached a clearing with nothing but piled tools, pickaxes, shovels. The commandant pointed at the ground. "This is your camp. Build your own huts. Tomorrow you start work on the railway." Dawn at Canyu 1 came with a rattle of canes on bamboo. Urquhart grabbed a pickaxe from the pile and joined the column, shuffling toward the rock face. The tool weighed nothing in his hands at first, but by mid-morning his palms were raw blisters. He was a skeleton in a loincloth, swinging iron at a wall of limestone that stretched ahead for 500 yards. This was Hellfire Pass, named later by Australian prisoners who watched the arc lamps flicker at night and imagined they were digging their own graves in the underworld. Lieutenant Usuki, the camp commandant whom the prisoners called the Black Prince, watched from a shaded rock. He carried a samurai sword and used it. When one prisoner tried to escape, Usuki ordered the man spread-eagled on the ground, then raised his blade. Urquhart closed his eyes, but he could not block the sound of the sword cutting air and bone. After that, he kept his head down and swung the pickaxe in a steady rhythm, conserving every ounce of strength for the next hour, the next day, the next month. Sergeant Okada, known as Dr. Death, patrolled the cutting with a bamboo cane. He liked to hurl stones at prisoners from the top of the pass and laugh when they flinched. Urquhart learned to work in the shadow of bigger men, to stay invisible. When the railway reached the River Kwai, he was assigned to the bridge, drilling holes into teak logs with an awl. He worked slowly, deliberately, and when the guards looked away, he sawed halfway through the wooden bolts that held the structure together. Small acts of sabotage, the only weapon left to a slave. The monsoon came in June 1943, and with it, cholera. Urquhart woke with violent diarrhea and projectile vomiting. His body dehydrated so fast that his skin shriveled like a picked grape. He crawled to the medical hut, where a doctor examined him with grim eyes. Mathieson, a Royal Army Medical Corps officer from Paisley, had seen this before. He told Urquhart he would have to be isolated. The death tent. 13 men went in that morning. Urquhart lay on the canvas floor, too weak to lift his head. Around him, men moaned and thrashed, their legs raised with knees bent, the telltale posture of cholera. One by one, they stopped moving. Orderlies came and dragged the bodies out. Urquhart was losing consciousness when someone forced a cup of sterilized water to his lips, then coconut milk. They kept him awake by shaking his shoulder, tapping his cheek, showing him a dog-eared photograph pulled from his pocket. "A blonde girl. Hazel Watson, remember her?" they said. "Keep fighting." For 24 hours, the orderlies force-fed him water and coconut milk. Urquhart drifted in and out of awareness, but the photograph stayed propped near his face. When he finally opened his eyes and recognized the girl he had danced with at the Palais de Danse in Aberdeen, something clicked back into place. He was the only man from that death tent to walk out alive. Mathieson signed the evacuation papers. A barge carried Urquhart downriver to Chungkai Hospital Camp, where he would learn to live again. Chungkai was a different world. 10,000 sick and broken men filled the jungle clearing, but there were no guards screaming Speedo. There were no work parties. Urquhart could not walk. His legs refused to carry him. The orderly sat him on a stool and tied a small bag of sand to his ankle. "Lift your foot," they said. He could not. They returned an hour later. "Try again this time." His toes twitched. By the end of the week, he was gripping parallel bars, hauling his skeleton frame forward inch by inch. One afternoon, a familiar voice called his name. Freddie Brine stood grinning in the sunlight, his brother Jim beside him. The boy soldiers had made it to Chungkai after all. Freddie swam across the river every day to collect firewood for the cooks, and he dragged Urquhart into the water with him. "You will swim again," he said. Soon, Urquhart was crossing the river twice daily, the current pulling at his wasted muscles, the cool water washing away months of filth and despair. Medical officers taught Urquhart how to care for the sick, how to keep a dying man's spirits up when there were no drugs to give him. Cricket commentator E.W. Swanton gave talks on test matches. Drag shows made the men laugh. For 6 months, Urquhart healed. But the Japanese kept records. When they needed fit men, they came looking. In March 1944, the order came down. Urquhart was declared fit for work. He said goodbye to Mathieson and Freddie Brine, boarded another steel wagon, and rode south for 5 days back to Singapore. The city he had left as a hopeful soldier now received him as a ghost. He was assigned to River Valley Road Camp, a holding pen for prisoners bound for the next phase of Japan's slave empire. The work was brutal but familiar. Every morning, Urquhart marched 3 miles to the docks, lifted sacks of rice and sugar onto his back, and carried them to warehouses under the watch of Korean guards. If he dropped a bag, they beat him with bamboo canes until he bled. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His tropical ulcers had healed, but the dysentery never really stopped. He lived one day at a time, keeping his head down, conserving energy, waiting. September 1944, the guards herded 900 prisoners onto a ship in Singapore harbor. Unmarked, no Red Cross. Urquhart climbed the gangway, looking back at the city skyline one last time. Below deck, the hold swallowed them. The hatches slammed shut. Darkness. The engines rumbled, and the ship slipped out into the South China Sea. Urquhart did not know where he was going. He only knew he had survived the railway. Now he would have to survive the water. For 2 days, the ship sat in port before joining a convoy heading north. Inside the hold, temperatures climbed past 100 degrees. Men vomited and fouled themselves where they stood. Thirst became a torture. The Japanese lowered a single bucket of rice down the hatch, but no water. The smell of sweat, blood, and human waste thickened the air until it was hard to breathe. On the 6th night, a tremendous blast tore through the hull. The ship shuddered and began listing to port. Water surged in from above as the hatch opened under the pressure. Urquhart was lifted by the rush of seawater and swept out of the hold like a cork from a bottle. He kicked clear of the sinking ship, coughing oil and seawater, and swam blindly away from the suction. When he looked back, the Kachidoki Maru was gone. The sea was on fire from a burning tanker, and screaming men thrashed in the oil-filled water. Urquhart spotted a small oval raft drifting past, a one-man raft made of cork, just big enough to sit in with his legs stretched out. He hauled himself aboard and lay there, chest-heaving, covered in crude oil. Dawn brought a flat, empty horizon. The raft had no food, no water, no sail. The tropical sun baked his skin, already burned by the explosion. His tongue swelled from dehydration. He tore a scrap of canvas from the raft's edge and draped it over his head, but it barely helped. By the second day, his eyes were seared nearly blind from the glare off the water. To stay sane, Urquhart sang old dance tunes in his head. It's a sin to tell a lie over and over. He forced himself to count imaginary stock in the Aberdeen warehouse where he had once worked. On the 5th day, his hallucinations faded and a strange calm settled over him. He was ready to let go when shouting woke him. Hands reached down, pulling him onto the deck of a Japanese whaler. He learned later that 159 survivors were rescued by American submarines, but Urquhart's raft had drifted too far. The whaler carried him to Hainan Island, where he was paraded naked through a village. Locals jeered and spat. He was too weak to stand from Hainan. He was loaded onto another hell ship for the voyage to Japan, delirious and barely alive. On that voyage, a familiar voice broke through the fever, Dr. Mathieson. He was the Ramsey officer who had saved Urquhart's life during the cholera outbreak on the railway. Mathieson had also been shipped north, transferred from one camp to another, and now he found himself tending Urquhart again. With no drugs, no instruments, only his hands and a calm voice, he kept Urquhart alive through the 11-day crossing. They landed at a port on the island of Kyushu. Trucks drove them inland to a bleak camp surrounded by barbed wire, Fukuoka Camp 25, near the city of Omuta. The Japanese put them to work in an open-cast coal mine. Urquhart weighed less than 80 pounds, his hair gone, his body a rack of bones, but Mathieson signed him off the labor gangs and made him a hospital orderly. The nightmare of the sea was over. The slave camps of Japan awaited. On the morning of August 9, 1945, Urquhart was emptying latrine cans behind the huts of Fukuoka Camp 25, pouring their contents onto the Japanese officers' tomato plants. A tremendous clap of thunder rolled in from the direction of Nagasaki, and then a sudden gust of hot air struck him like a giant hairdryer. The blast knocked his shrunken frame sideways, forcing him to brace himself with his bamboo ladle. He had no idea what had caused it. The United States had just dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing 39,000 people in an instant. Urquhart stood 20 miles from ground zero. The shock wave had passed directly over him, coating his lungs and skin in invisible radiation that would shadow his health for decades. On August 15th, the camp commander read the declaration of the cessation of hostilities. The war was over. In the days that followed, the Japanese guards grew quiet and confused. A frantic Japanese man appeared at the hospital hut begging Dr. Mathieson and Urquhart to treat his sick daughter. They walked to his home, sponged down the girl's fever, and the family pressed 2 bolts of expensive Japanese silk into their hands. Urquhart kept his piece folded safely in his belongings, a small thread of warmth in a world turned to dust and ash. By late August, U.S. Marines rolled through the camp gates, throwing cigarettes and chocolate to the skeletal prisoners. Urquhart weighed 82 pounds. He boarded the aircraft carrier USS Cape Gloucester in Nagasaki Harbor and took his first proper shower in 3.5 years. As the ship sailed out past the ruined city, Glenn Miller's sentimental journey crackled over the tannoy. The journey home took 3 months: Okinawa, Manila, Hawaii, San Francisco. In San Francisco, a kind woman named Ash took him under her wing, driving him through California's redwood forests and along the Big Sur coast. He had not tasted freedom in over 3 years. Every new sight, the cars, the shops, the faces of people who had never known a prison camp, felt overwhelming. He arrived at Aberdeen Station on November 18, 1945. His mother, father, and sister were waiting on the platform, and his mother wept at the sight of him, a skeleton in an oversized uniform, his hair gone, his eyes hollow. He spent months walking the cold streets alone, unable to eat, unable to sleep, haunted by the faces of the men who had not come home. But slowly he rebuilt his life. He met a young woman named Mary Milne at the Palais de Danse, and they married. He became managing director of a plumbing supplies company and kept the vow he had made in a Japanese prison camp to spend his life caring for others. When Mary suffered a stroke years later, he nursed her for 12 years. Tommy Barker, the signals corporal from Blackpool, survived the war and returned to his family in England. The 2 friends never met again. Lieutenant Usuki, the Black Prince, was hanged after the war for his crimes on the Death Railway. Sergeant Okada, known as Dr. Death, was sentenced to only 10 years in prison for his atrocities. Freddie Bryn, the irrepressible boy soldier who had taught him to swim again on the River Kwai, died of cirrhosis within a decade of returning home, never fully escaping the camps. Mathieson returned to Scotland, his quiet work done, his patients saved wherever will and compassion could reach them. If you or your family have any stories from this era, memories of loved ones who served in the Far East, or personal connections to the prisoners of the Japanese, please share them in the comments below. We read every one, and if you would like to help us keep telling these important stories, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Thank you for listening and for remembering.